Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. I'm really happy that the High Elves are finally coming back to the old world. I built a few models from my old collection and I'm testing out some color schemes for an army. Last week we painted up a Spearman and a Swordmaster, and this week let's paint a couple Sisters of Avelorn. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the models, I undercoated them in white primer. I want these models to have a really bright white finish, so it's important to make sure the primer is smooth and bright. First I painted the skin, with an equal parts mix of contrast medium and Darkoath flesh. After that layer dried, I painted a second layer to reinforce the shadows. Rather than paint it all over, I painted it directly into the deepest recesses. Let's base coat the white areas with a familiar mix from the last video, about 4 parts contrast medium to 1 part Stormvermin fur. I think really bright white is one of the defining characteristics of High Elves, and this is one of the ways I like to achieve a bright white. Since this paint is very transparent, it really depends on having a white undercoat. Apply this paint just like any other contrast paint. Work on one section at a time, use plenty of paint, and then soak up any excess paint if needed. For a really bright finish, I like to rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to soak up extra paint off the raised edges. It's kind of like getting a quick highlight before the paint dries. We'll highlight the white areas later, so let's move on for now. I painted the undershirts with a mix of Flesh Terror's Red and Black Templar. This is a mix I made for my Tyranids, and you can learn how to mix your own in this video here. I used this color because I have a whole bottle already mixed, and it was convenient. The exact color doesn't matter too much though, and if you don't feel like mixing anything, I think just about any dark color would work just fine. Next I painted all the leather with Wyldwood. I'm not too worried if some of the paint gets on the unpainted areas, but do your best to avoid making any mistakes on the painted surfaces, especially the white. The leather looks a little streaky and uneven. This can happen sometimes when painting a very dark, transparent color over a white base coat, and it's really easy to fix with a glaze. I thinned down some Wyldwood with an equal amount of water, and with very little paint on the brush, I repainted over any uneven areas. Let's paint the metal areas next with Iron Hand steel. The belts have some gold details, but I think it's easier to just paint over them right now rather than try to avoid those areas. I'm also not worried about getting any paint on the trim of the skirts, since that will get an opaque layer of paint later anyway. Although you want to be really careful while painting the hands, and try your best to avoid getting any paint on the bows. If you make a mistake, it's okay, just wait for the paint to dry and touch it up with white. With the metal base coated, next I shaded those areas with Gryph-Charger gray. This color has a bluish green kind of tone, which I think complements the rest of the color scheme. I also like to add extra color wherever possible, especially in old world and fantasy models. Once the shade dried, I highlighted the metals with a light dry brush of Iron Hand steel. Be really careful around the bow. I went for more of a controlled highlight on the arms to avoid spilling any paint on the bows. Let's paint the bows next with Tyron Blue shade paint. If you made any mistakes on the bow earlier, make sure to touch them up first with white or light gray paint. I'd like to add some darker tones to the bows, so I mixed a small amount of Aeldari Emerald into the blue shade, about 4 parts blue shade to 1 part emerald. I painted this mix on the flames and blended out the edge of the paint. Blending contrast paint is really easy. Paint a small section, rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend out the edge. Keep working all the way around, and keep an eye on the sections you just painted. Sometimes the paint will pool too much, and it's a good idea to soak up any excess paint with a brush. I like the effect on the bows so far, but I'd like the flames to be a little bit darker on the ends. So I painted another layer of the blue and green shade mix, and I blended the paint the same way as before. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. There are lots of different ways to paint hair, and I'd like to paint two different kinds of blonde hair. One will be more of a yellow blonde color, and the other kind of a silvery blonde. Both types start with a base coat of Bonewhite. For the yellow blonde hair, I painted it with an equal parts mix of Skeleton Horde and Nazdreg yellow. And for the silvery blonde hair, I made a mix of mostly Nuln Oil with a small amount of Bonewhite. This color ended up being really close to the Stormvermin fur mix from earlier, and you could just as easily use that instead. Before I move on to the next colors, I'd like to paint some thin black outlines in a few areas. This technique is often called blacklining, and it will give the model some extra definition. I think it will be easier to paint it now, before base coating the other areas. I added some black around any areas that aren't painted yet, like around the crowns, the skirt trim, and the scabbard on the back. It's really difficult to get a perfectly thin line, and it's much easier to lean the brush against the unpainted area. That way I can ensure that no paint gets on the painted sections. It's okay if black paint gets on the unpainted areas, since I'll be painting those with opaque paint next. Next I painted the gold areas with Retributor armor, leaving a thin black outline. Then I shaded the gold with Skeleton Horde. Now for the green cloaks, which I base coated with Warpstone Glow. Green paints tend to be transparent, and Warpstone Glow is no exception. Unfortunately, this paint does not have good coverage, and it'll take multiple thin layers. It's important to have patience here and take your time. Thin the paint slightly with water, and paint a thin layer. Do your best to make the paint smooth and even, and avoid the temptation to lay down the paint too thick. Here's what it looks like after one layer. Pretty streaky. Have patience and paint a second layer and allow it to dry. With each successive layer, the finish will get more even, and as long as you keep your paints thin, you should get a smooth finish without any bad texture. Here's the final results, a nice smooth finish after 5 thin layers. Rather than using a wash to shade the green, I'm going to mix a darker green and paint that tone directly into the shadow areas. This is equal parts Warpstone Glow and Caliban green. I thinned it slightly with water and painted a thin glaze in each of the folds of the cloak. If you want to learn more about this technique and how to blend the paint, check out this advanced guide here. It takes a little more time to paint this way, but it gives a much smoother finish. And since I just spent a bunch of time making sure the green is smooth, I think it's worth spending the extra time. If you prefer to use a standard wash instead, I would recommend Beoltan Green shade. Next I painted the gems and sword handles with black. I just realized that I forgot to paint the gold design on the wrist armor, so I quickly based and shaded those areas. At this stage you could base the models and call them finished, but I'd like to add some highlights, so let's keep going. First, let's paint some details on the face, including the eyes. I carefully painted the eyes with thinned black. Then I painted the eyes white, leaving a thin black outline. Next, I painted the pupils with black. I like to pay attention to where the model is looking, and try to point the eyes in that direction. I'm going to make her looking off to the side a little bit, in the direction she's pointing the bow. Next, I added some color. The models on the box art look like they have some green eyeshadow, and I think that's a nice complement to the green on the rest of the model. When painting this kind of thing, it's really important to thin the paint more than you think you need to, and have barely any paint on your brush. Subtlety is key here. You can always add more. Next, I thinned down some Khorne red and painted it in the same kind of manner, adding a little bit of color to the cheeks and lower lip. At such a small scale, I think it's only worth painting the lower lip. Anything more than that tends to look like clown makeup. Now let's highlight the white, beginning with some soft glazes of gray number 8 from my custom grayscale. And you can learn how to mix your own set here. This is a very light gray, nearly white, and it will provide the best foundation for the white highlights later. Thin the paint with some water, and with barely any paint on the brush, add some glazes over the white areas and smooth out any spots where the base coat dried unevenly. Build up a few layers for the best result. With the white glazes done, now we can go in with pure white and pick out the edges. I like using that light gray to start out. It's so light, it functions as a white paint, but it still leaves room for a pure white highlight at the very end. If you have a very steady hand, you can paint a freehand border around the cape. I used the green shade mix from earlier. If you make any mistakes, they're easy to fix with white or light gray. Next, I highlighted the green with a mix of toxic yellow and warpstone glow. You could mix a few different midtones and blend them if you like. Since these models are for an army, I'd like to save time wherever I can. So I'm just going to make one mix and paint it on the edges. Let's highlight the edges of the leather next with Steel Legion Drab. This is a pretty big jump up in value from the dark base coat, so you'll want to make sure the highlights are very narrow and precise. If you want to paint a midtone first, I would recommend a mix of Steel Legion Drab and Dryad Park. Next, I highlighted the red undershirt with Mephiston red. Followed by a sharp highlight of Wild Rider red. I highlighted the sword handles and straps with Stormvermin fur. Next, I highlighted some of the steel areas with Stormhost silver. I don't want to get too crazy with this highlight, since these models are for an army. I'm painting just a couple highlights on the arms and the scabbard on the back. Then I highlighted the edges of the gold with a mix of Retributor armor and Stormhost silver. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Liberator Gold is a close match. Next I highlighted the silvery blonde hair with Bonewhite. Depending on how light or dark your shade is, you may want to lighten the Bonewhite with a touch of white paint. I ended up adding a small amount of white to mine. Paint as many or as few highlights as you like. For the yellow blonde hair, I mixed about equal parts Bonewhite and Averland Sunset. I think the bows could use a small highlight, so I thinned down some white paint and picked out a few of the edges on the lighter sections near the middle. I'd like the outer edges to be darker, so I didn't bother with highlighting those areas. Next I painted the gems. From a black undercoat, I painted the gems with Khorne red, leaving a thin, black outline. Then I painted a crescent shape with Evil Sunz Scarlet on the lower half of each gem. Followed by a smaller crescent shape of Fire Dragon. And then a very narrow line of Toxic Yellow. Finally, I added a reflection with a dot of white. I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue to the base, and then sprinkled on coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a heavy dry brush of Mournfang Brown, then a dry brush of Balor Brown, and finally a light dry brush of Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang Brown, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I really like the green and white color scheme. Even though that green base coat took some time, I think the final result is worth it. Painting a whole army with that green would be tough, but I think I could manage to paint a dozen or so without going insane. What do you think? Are there any time-consuming colors or techniques you like or dislike? What makes a technique worth the time investment, and where do you draw the line? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.